Hi kids, it's time for the Narnia, Chapter 15, Deeper Magic from Before the Dawn of Time. While the two girls still crouched in the bushes with their hands over their faces, they heard the voice of the witch calling out, "Now, follow me all, and we will set about what remains of this war. It will not take us long to crush the human vermin and the traitors now that the great fool, the great cat, lies dead." At this moment the children were for a few seconds in very great danger. For the wild cries and the noise of curling pipes and shrill horns blowing, the whole of that vile rabble came sweeping off the hilltop and down the slope right past their hiding place. They felt the scepter go by them like cold wind, and they felt the ground shake beneath them under the galloping feet of the Minotaurs. And overhead there went the flurry of flower wings and blackness of vultures and giant bats. At any other time they would have trembled with fear, but now the sadness and shame and horror of Aslan's death so filled their minds that they could hardly think of it. As soon as the woods was silent again, Susan and Lucy crept out of their hiding spot. The moon was getting low, and thin clouds were passing across her, but still they could see the shape of the lion lying dead. And down they both knelt in the wet grass, and kissed his cold feet, and stroked his beautiful fur, what was left of it, and cried till there could cry no more. And then they looked at each other, and held each other's hands for merely loneliness, and cried again, and then again were silent. At last Lucy said, "I can't bear to look at this horrible muzzle. I wonder, could we take it off?" So they cried, and after a lot of working at it, they succeeded. And when they saw his face without it, they burst out crying again, and kissed it, and wiped away the blood and the foam as well as they could. And it was all merely lonely and hopeless and horrid. "I wonder, could we untie him as well?" said Susan. But the enemies, out of pure spitefulness, had drawn the cords so tight that the girls could make nothing out of the knots. I hope no one who reads this book has been quite as miserable as Susan and Lucy were that night. But if you've been up all night and cried till there was no more tears in you, you would know that there comes in the end a sort of quietness. You feel as if nothing is ever going to happen again. At any rate, that was how it felt for these two. Hours and hours seemed to go by in the dead calm, and they hardly noticed that they were getting colder and colder. But at last Lucy noticed two other things. One was the sky on the east side of the hill was a little less dark than it had been an hour ago. The other, some tiny movement going on in the grass at her feet. At first she took no interest in this. What does it matter? Nothing mattered now. But at last she saw that whatever it was had begun to move up the upright stones of the stone table, and now, whatever they were, moving about on Aslan's body. She peered closer. They were tiny little gray things. "Ugh," said Susan. "How beastly! There are horrid little mice crawling over him. Go away, you little beasts," she said. "Wait," said Lucy, who had been looking at them more closely. "Can't you see what they're doing?" Both girls bent down and stared. "I do believe," said Susan. "But how queer. They're nibbling away at the cords." "That's what I thought," said Susan. "I think they're friendly mice. Poor little things. They don't realize he's dead. They think it'll do some good untying him." It was quite definitely lighter by now. Each of the girls noticed for the first time the white face of the other. They could see the mice nibbling away, dozens and dozens, even hundreds of little mice. And at last, one by one, the ropes were gnawed through. The sky in the east was whitish by now, and the stars were getting fainter, all except one very big, one low, down on the eastern horizon. They felt colder than they had been all night. The mice crept away again. The girls cleared away what remained of the ropes. Aslan looked more like himself without them. Every moment his dead face looked nobler as the light grew and they could see it better. In the wood behind them a bird gave a chuckling sound. It had been still for so many hours. Then another bird answered it. So there were birds singing all over the place. It was quite definitely early morning now, not late night. "I'm so cold," said Lucy. "So am I," said Susan. Let's walk about a bit. They walked to the eastern edge of the hill and looked down. The one big star had almost disappeared. The country all looked dark gray, but beyond, at the very edge of the world, the sea showed pale. The sky began to turn red. They walked to and fro more times than they could count between the dead Aslan and the ridge, trying to keep warm. And oh, how tired their legs felt. Then at last, as they stood for a moment looking out towards the sea and Cair Paravel, the red turned to gold along the line where the sea and the sky met, and very slowly came up to the edge of the sun. At that moment they heard from behind them a loud noise, a great cracking. "What's that?" said Lucy. I'm afraid to turn around," said Susan. "Something awful is happening." "They're doing something worse to him," said Lucy. "Come on." And she turned, pulling Susan around with her. The rising of the sun had made everything look so different. All colors and shadows were changed, that for a moment they didn't even see the important thing. Then they did. The stone table was broken into 2 pieces by a great crack that ran down it from the end, and there was no Aslan. "Oh, oh!" cried the 2 girls, rushing back to the table. "Oh, it's too bad," sobbed Lucy. "They might have left the body alone." "Who's done it?" cried Susan. "What does it mean? Is it more magic?" "Yes," said a great voice behind their backs. "It is more magic." They looked around. There, shining in the sunrise, larger than they had ever seen him before, shaking his mane, stood Aslan himself. "Oh, Aslan!" cried the girls. "Aren't you dead then, dear Aslan?" said Lucy. "Not now," said Aslan. "You're not, asked Susan. She couldn't bring herself to say the word ghost. Aslan stopped his golden head and licked her forehead. The warmth of his breath and the rich sort of smell that seemed to hang about him came all over her. "Do I look it?" he said. "Oh, you're real, you're real. Oh, Aslan!" cried Lucy. "But what does it all mean?" said Susan. "It means," said Aslan, "that though the witch knew the deep magic, there is a magic deeper still which she does not know. Her knowledge goes back only to the dawn of time, but if she could looked back a little further, in the stillness and the darkness before time dawned, she would have read there a different incantation. She would know that when a willing victim who had committed no treachery was killed on the table, it would crack and death itself would start working backwards. And now—" "Oh, yes, now?" said Lucy. "Oh, children," said the lion, "I feel my strength coming back to me. Oh, children, catch me if you can." He stood for a second, his eyes were bright, his limbs quivering, lashing himself with his tail. Then he made a leap high over their heads and landed on the other side of the table. Laughing, though she didn't know why, Lucy scrambled over him to reach him. Aslan leaped again. A mad chase began. Round and round the hilltop he led them, now hopelessly out of their reach, not letting them almost catch his tail, now diving between them, now tossing them in the air with his huge and beautiful velveted paws, and catching them again. It was such a romp as no one had ever expected in Narnia, and whether it was more like playing with a thunderstorm or playing with a kitten, Lucy could never make up her mind. And the funny thing was that when all 3 finally lay together, panting in the sun, the girls no longer felt in the least tired or hungry or thirsty. "And now," said Aslan, "to business. I feel I am going to roar. You had better put your fingers in your ears." And they did. And Aslan stood up, and when he opened his mouth to roar, his face began so terrible that they did not dare to look at it. Then they saw all the trees in front of him bend down before the blast of his roar. Then he said, "We have a long journey to go. You must ride on me." And he crouched down, and the children climbed onto his warm, golden back, and Susan sat first. And with the great heave, he rose underneath them and then shot off, faster than any horse could have gone. That ride was perhaps the most wonderful thing that happened to them in Narnia. Have you ever had a gallop on a horse? Think of that, and then take away the heavy noise in the hooves and the jingle of the bits. and imagine instead the almost noiseless paddling and great paws. Then imagine instead of the black or gray or chestnut back of the horse the soft roughness of golden fur, and the mane flying back in the wind. And then imagine you're going about twice as fast as any racehorse. But this is a mount that doesn't need to be guided and never grows tired. He rushes on, never missing his footing, never hesitating, threading his way with perfect skill between the tree trunks, jumping over bush and briar and the small streams. And you are riding not on a road, nor in a park, nor even on the downs, but right across Narnia in spring, down solemn avenues of beech and across sunny glades of oak. It was nearly midday when they found themselves looking down a steep hillside at a castle. A little toy castle it looked from where they stood, which seemed to be all pointed towers. But the lion was rushing down at such a speed that it grew larger every moment, and before they had time even to ask themselves what it was they were already on a level with it. And now it no longer looked like a toy castle. No face looked over the battlement, and the gates were fast shut. And Aslan, not at all slacking his pace, rushed through as a bullet towards it. "The witch is home!" he cried. "Now, children, hold tight!" Next moment the whole world seemed to turn upside down, and the children felt as if they had left their insides behind them. For the lion had gathered himself together for a greater leap than any he had made yet, and jumped, or you may call it flying rather than jumping, right over the castle wall. The two girls, breathless but unhurt, found themselves tumbling off his back in the middle of the wide stone courtyard full of statues.